I'm going to, in 10 minutes, do what myself and other colleagues at ONC tend to spend an hour or more covering. So these are just going to be highlights for the group. The usual disclaimer when federal folks speak, what we say may or may not necessarily represent the views of our agency, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, or the government in general. And I chuckle every time I say that these days. Thank you, Rebecca, for texting me and letting me know you can hear me. That would be my former chief nursing officer at ONC, who must have joined a little bit late. Anyway, so let's talk a little bit about what ONC is. I think everybody knows ONC. We certify health IT and coordinate on health IT across the sector. What many folks may or may not be aware of is 4 years ago, in the intercession between the last administration and this administration, Congress actually stepped into this space very dramatically. The 21st Century Cures really enhanced ONC's mission. First, we were asked to report back to Congress on efforts that the executive branch could do to reduce clinician burden. We partnered with CMS. I'm delighted that my colleague Mary Green will follow me. But we outlined 4 large areas where we identified administrative regulatory burdens and other factors that could, if we took action on them, actually make things better. And I think that spawned a tremendous amount of work at CMS. And I'm very, very proud of Mary and her colleagues for continuing down that road. We, ONC, were also asked to talk a little bit about what would be a reason for not sharing information that the patient has asked to be shared. So the exceptions to information blocking. We're going to get into that in a little bit more details. And then we were asked to specify on the technical side how we could enhance interoperability. The 21st Century Cures statute was all about making clinical information move. So the purpose of our final rule, which, boy, talk about timing and complexity, we released this rule literally a week before the government and the country shut down because of the pandemic. And as many of you know, we've needed to make some adjustments to our compliance timelines as a result of that. But what did our rule attempt to do? So first of all, for those of you aficionados of regulatory space, our 2015 edition, which had our most recent edition, was updated. Some complexity as to why we didn't just call it the 2020 edition, but we wanted to not trigger a bunch of regulatory things. So this is the 2015 edition enhanced. We also changed our certification program, and many of you may not be aware. When health IT developers get certified, that's a one-time episode. And then until there's another set of regulations that they have to certify to, there was no interval statement that they continued to be in compliance. So we now have added conditions of maintenance and certification requirements. It's sort of technical stuff behind the scene, but it holds developers accountable for making sure that they keep their software up to date as content evolves. I've already referenced the information blocking. And then we were asked by Congress, because children and babies are just not little adults, to sort of put in some of that content that is more appropriate for pediatrics that some of our early regs didn't include. So we have put in place, I know, a busy slide. I don't think this would be a surprise to anybody. This is US CDI. I wouldn't be a federal bureaucrat without having an acronym. The US Core Data for Interoperability. This is version 2, which we released this week. Not only did we identify the key content that software developers had to have within their systems to share, we put forward and has been adopted both by our federal advisory group, the ONC, and through the regulatory process, a standards advancement so that each interval period of time, we will have additional content that is updated and required. Again, this would be one of the things that the developers will need to incorporate over time. You can see the new data classes. These were released on Tuesday of this week through a very public process. And there's a public process to get additional content in that isn't in the US CDI. So this is version 2 proposed. It will be adopted over the course of the next year or so. And you can start to see that over time, what we're doing is trying to enhance that content, which is available for information to be shared and for information to move. I'd also call your attention to the demographics. In the demographics, that is the basis and the underlying thinking around patient matching and patient identity. We are currently working through another report back to Congress on identity and patient matching that will be released in the near term once it finishes clearance. So how does all of this work? How do these standards work? And this group certainly doesn't need me to talk about FHIR or APIs, but one of the things, the original 2015 version of our reg basically said, look, there has to be a standardized way to get stuff in and out of the records. And we talked about application programming interfaces, but we didn't identify a single standard. With this rule, we identified a standard and we promulgated it, and it is now required. Over the course of the past 4 years, there's been a tremendous amount of evolution and capability in the HL7 FHIR specification space, and it continues to evolve. And this is going to be the last slide I have before I segue over to Mary, but it's really important that some of the things that we've identified as substantial burden to clinicians are things that we try and tackle. We, by specifying what the standards are, in this case, it's FHIR-based API, and we use our authority under the Public Health Service Act to synergize with our partners at CMS, who are now releasing and bringing forward a strategy to decrease the burden around prior authorization and make that usable for clinicians and not a bureaucratic nightmare, as we heard over and over again from ordering clinicians. I would also point out again an acronym, the ICAD task force. And this was a group of folks, not just government folks, but folks drawn from NCVHS, drawn from our high-tech, with deep knowledge, who over the past year had a very public session where they brought forward a report on the direction that this should go. That report was approved in November and is the basis for some of these changes. I've got 45 seconds. Thank you, Kevin. And I'm going to segue right now to my last slide, which I'm going to skip. This is the timing that I suggested is going to be a little bit delayed because of the COVID pandemic, and about half the community thinks we've delayed inappropriately. The other half of the community wants us to delay even further, so we think we're in the right space.